All right, now to discuss this all-important election in Russia and as to what it means for Russia, the world at large, and also as to what it would mean for India, we are joined by a panel of experts. Now, in the studio, we're joined in by Mr. Arun Singh, who's a former ambassador to the United States. He's joining us in the studio here with me. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador, for joining us. And also, we're joined by Mr. Fred Weir, who is a Russian affairs expert, who's joining us from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed, Fred, for joining us from Moscow. And we are also joined by Kadira Petya-Goda, who is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, who's joining us from Melbourne. Ambassador Singh, let me actually begin with you on this. Now, this is a crucial election that's going to be watched not just in Russia, but across the world. How much of a consequence is this in Russia alone, that the man has been in power for the last 18 years, and it appears that he is likely to just cement his position?
Of course, it's an important election from the Russian point of view, for the leadership there to get a reaffirmation from the people of the kind of policies they've been following. And I had the opportunity to serve twice in Moscow. And one of the stints that I served in Moscow was from 1997 to 2000. And I was there when on 31st December 1999, President Yeltsin surprisingly announced that he would resign and hand over power to Mr. Putin. But before that, you could see that Mr. Putin's rise had been phenomenal. He came in 1997 as a deputy in the presidential administration. Then he headed the Federal Security Bureau. After that, he headed the National Security Council. In August 1999, he was appointed the Prime Minister by Mr. Yeltsin, and then the President. So clearly at that time, when there was a sense in Russia that things were falling apart, the economy was not doing well, the post-Soviet consolidation of the system had not happened, people started turning to Mr. Putin as the person who could try and bring it all together, consolidate the new political system, get the economy perhaps going again. And in Russia, people had started getting a sense that they were being pushed from all directions, and whether they could look at reviving what the Soviet Union and what Russia stood for.
Absolutely. These are some important points. Now, Vladimir Putin is, of course, credited as the man who took Russia out of the doldrums after the chaos of the Soviet collapse. Now, Fred Weir, let me bring you in on this. Now, Vladimir Putin is, of course, gunning for a historic fourth term as the president of Russia. Why is there so little opposition to Vladimir Putin in Russia?
Well, I think there are two explanations for that, both of them true. One is the Kremlin has kind of landscaped the political garden, plucked the weeds, like, as you mentioned, Alexei Navalny was excluded from the ballot. It stage manages the elections to some extent, but on the other explanation, which is also absolutely right, is that Putin has done a phenomenal job of resurrecting Russia. It was near collapse when he came to power 18 years ago. I remember, I've been here through all that, and he has restored the sense of unity, national unity. Russians are very patriotic people, resilient people. He has stood up to the West as Russians see it, things like NATO expansion and the sanctions and things that the West has done to pressure Russia. Putin has stood up to that and overcome that to a great extent. Russians basically support him. I mean, I can't go out of my home without talking to people who they may not be wildly enthusiastic, but they basically see no alternative to him and think he's done a fine job. So it is a somewhat authoritarian system, but on the other hand, there is an element of democracy to it, and Russians support Putin, and you'll see the results by the end of this day.
Absolutely, indeed. The results will be watched out very closely, although few people would doubt as to whether Putin will win or not by the end of this day. And also, Kadira Petya-Goda, let me bring you in on this. This is an election that will also be watched very closely because of the allegations of Russia's meddling in the US elections. Now, generally, people say that every time there is a sort of a confrontation of Russia involving the West, it is Putin who emerges stronger. So the fact that the US has in fact only recently imposed sanctions on Russia, and there's also this controversy, this spat between Russia and Britain over the attack that took place on the British diplomat. Has this in fact strengthened Putin's hand in this election?
Yes, definitely. I think that every step that the West takes to pressure Russia, to isolate Russia, it affects for strengthening Putin's hand. And you see this in a lot of other countries which have a sense of feeling under siege by Western powers.
Right.
And I think, if you look at the statistics, the majority of people in Russia actually regret the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so there's this strong feeling there that they want to be a great power, and I think that they see Putin as the best way to keep ensuring that.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, Fred, if I can bring you in on this, this election is also quite remarkable because of the lack of opposition. Now, according to analysts, they say that Vladimir Putin, by the end of the day, could have won by a landslide of about 70% of all votes that are polled. Let's talk a little about his opponents in this election. Alexei Navalny, he's of course been disqualified because of corruption charges. The other person who's making a lot of waves is Ksenia Sobchak, who's said to be something of a Paris Hilton within Russia. But is there any realistic chance at all that any of the opponents of Vladimir Putin will in fact end up making a mark in Russia?
Well, no, and ironically, Alexei Navalny, who has been excluded by a variety of legal maneuvers, is the one most like Putin of all of them. The others there's a big spectrum and of real opposition figures, people like Pavel Grudinin, who is the Communist Party candidate. I know him personally. He is a very solid left-wing thinking person. He's generated quite a lot of buzz among communist voters in Russia. There's Grigory Yavlinsky, who is an old-fashioned liberal, pro-Western. There are 7 opponents of Putin, and they're all real people. They've all had access to the media. They've all had their say.
Right.
Is a measure, of Putin's vast popularity, the fact that he has brought Russia up by its bootstraps and recreated the country in a lot of ways, that he can stand against a full spectrum of opposition and without any fear of losing. Of course, he did not take part in the debates. There's something czar-like about Putin. He is, and this is Russian political culture in action. The leader is somehow above the fray. He doesn't have to go on TV and face his opponents personally and debate them. But on the other hand, there's just no doubt about his overwhelming popularity. This, in fact, will be probably the best result he has had in the 4 times he has stood for election. At least if polls are to be believed and the evidence of our eyes and years, he will do better in this.
And also, Kadira Petegora, let me just bring you in on this. Ksenia Sobchak is someone who's been making a lot of waves, at least in the Western media. The fact that there has not been a female presidential candidate for the last 14 years, does it surprise you?
Well, I think, you've got to look at where Russian culture is at and where the status of women is at, and in that sense, it's probably not that surprising that the field of candidates would reflect the society as a whole.
Absolutely, indeed. Probably a reflection of Russian society. Closing comments here, Ambassador Singh. Let me ask you this. At the end of the day, will Vladimir Putin have emerged as someone who is simply unchallenged? Not since Joseph Stalin has there been a leader who's been leading Russia for this period of time.
Certainly, I think not for this length of time, but after Stalin also, there were leaders who were seen strong at their time. Khrushchev had a certain strength, there was Brezhnev who had a certain strength, and he was there for an extended length of time. But certainly, you're right that the kind of length of time that President Putin is likely to enjoy, nobody has seen. But I think it reflects that he is seen as the person who can hold everything together in the new context. It's a different context, it's a different system, a new system is being built. Relations with the West have become adversarial because after 1990, when the Soviet Union had been dissolved, for a while, for almost a decade,
Right.
The new Russia tried to improve relations with the West
Okay.
and build cooperation with the West and ignore some of its traditional partners. But it was only when they felt that the West was pushing Russia back, that
Okay.
West saw itself as the victor in the Cold War and Russia as the vanquished, and that there was NATO expansion to the East. Only when that happened that the new mood started in Russia, and Vladimir Putin reflected that.
Absolutely, indeed. We'll have to leave it there because we're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed to all my guests, to Ambassador Singh, who's joined us in the studio here in Noida, to Fred Weir, the Russian affairs expert who's joined us from Moscow, and also to Kadira Petyagoda. Thank you very much indeed. Now, this, of course, is a very crucial election which will be watched out not just in Russia, but around the world for its implications.